When we hear the word the Middle Ages, we often imagine paintings inspired by books, movies, and computer games. I can see majestic castles with tall towers, knights in shining armor, beautiful ladies in magnificent dresses, noisy feasts, and heroic tournaments. It seems that this era was filled with romance, adventure, and lofty ideals. Indeed, the Middle Ages left behind a rich cultural heritage: music, architecture, literature. But behind all this grandeur, everyday life was hidden, and it was she who was truly terrifying. If a person of the 21st century suddenly found himself in a medieval town or even in a castle, the first thing he would notice was the smell. A suffocating mixture of rot, smoke, sweat, manure, and sewage was constantly in the air. The second thing that would catch your eye is dirt. It was everywhere, on the streets, on people's clothes, in their hair, in their homes. We live in a world where hygiene is the norm, where daily showering, brushing teeth, and washing clothes seem like natural things. For the inhabitants of the Middle Ages, all this was a luxury, and often it was considered unnecessary or even harmful. Today, we will try to look behind the facade of chivalrous romance and see the everyday reality of medieval Europe. We will learn how people treated cleanliness, why washing was considered dangerous, what the smell of a medieval city was, how parasites and diseases lived next to a person, and why faith in the power of dirt could cost the lives of thousands of people. Chapter 1. The myth of the unwashed people of the Middle Ages. There is a popular myth. Supposedly, people in the Middle Ages never washed. They walked around unwashed for years, covered with a layer of dirt, and perceived this as the norm. In popular culture, this image has become very firmly entrenched. We imagine a medieval peasant in ragged clothes with unwashed hair covered with lice and fleas. But how does this correspond to reality? In fact, everything was more complicated. In the early Middle Ages, especially in the 9th, 11th centuries, hygiene existed as a habit. Public baths could be found in towns and even in some villages. They resembled Roman baths, although they were much more modest. There, people could wash, steam, relax, and sometimes even have feasts. In the chronicles of the 12th century, there are mentions that the townspeople visited the baths with whole families, and it was something like a Sunday ritual. For example, in Cologne and Nuremberg, public baths operated regularly and were popular. There were dozens of them in Paris in the 13th century. It was possible not only to wash there, but also to chat. There were even special bath snack bars, where food was served. Some historians call a medieval bathhouse an analog of a modern cafe or spa. However, the situation gradually began to change. By the 13th and 14th centuries, attitudes towards baths had become suspicious. Firstly, people of different genders often gathered there, and this gave rise to rumors of debauchery. The church began to condemn visits to baths, considering them hotbeds of sin. Secondly, with the growth of epidemics, the thought arose: aren't baths becoming a source of disease? The most tragic turning point occurred in the 14th century during the Black Death epidemic. The plague, which raged in Europe from 1347 to 1353, claimed the lives of almost a third of the continent's population. People, desperately looking for an explanation, began to believe that bathing in water opens the pores and allows the disease to enter the body. Doctors of the time argued, washing weakens the body and makes it vulnerable. The church supported this idea. Some priests said that frequent bathing corrupts the soul and weakens the strength of the spirit. The baths began to close one by one. By the 15th century, there were almost no public baths left in Paris, although they had flourished 2 centuries before. Thus, the myth of unwashed people has a foundation. Indeed, in the late Middle Ages, regular washing became rare. But you can't say that they never washed in Europe. It's just that this habit was lost, and by the 16th century, Europeans already perceived dirt as the norm. Interestingly, at the same time, the Crusaders who returned from the East reported with surprise. Muslims perform ablutions several times a day, wash their hands and face before prayer, and take care of the cleanliness of their bodies and clothes. For Europeans, this seemed strange, and sometimes even suspicious. Purity became a cultural marker that separated East and West. Chapter 2. Is water an enemy or a friend? We used to think that water is a source of purity. But for a medieval man, water could be a threat. The fact is that the water quality was terrible. Urban rivers and wells often became sources of disease. The river in the medieval city performed several functions at once. Waste was drained into it. Laundry was washed in it. Animals were bathed. Corpses of dogs or cats were thrown out. And at the same time, water was taken from it for cooking. For example, in London, the River Thames was both a sewer and a source of drinking water. The chronicles of the 16th century describe that on hot days, the river literally bubbles with a stench. But it was from her that they drew water for cooking. No wonder the water seemed dangerous. Washing your face with it means putting yourself at risk. Doctors claimed that if you bathe too often, your body will weaken, and diseases will enter through open pores. Therefore, bathing gradually became considered harmful. Instead, the so-called dry wash appeared. People were rubbed with cloths soaked in vinegar, oil, or herbal decoctions. Sometimes powders of chalk or aromatic herbs were used to hide the smell. The nobility could afford to rub themselves with rose water or wine. The poor used vinegar rags. There were stranger methods. For example, sheep's wool was believed to have a cleansing power. People rubbed their skin with sheep's fat, hoping that it would protect them from diseases. Hair has become a separate story. Washing your hair with water was considered dangerous. The hair was supposed to be combed and rubbed with oils. For this purpose, combs with frequent teeth were used. But the main purpose of these combs was not beauty, but the fight against lice. Sometimes flour or powder was used to clean the hair. It was poured on the hair and then combed out along with dirt and parasites. This method later transformed into the famous powder of the 16th century, which was sprinkled on wigs. Thus, water has ceased to be a symbol of purity. For a medieval man, it was a dangerous element, a source of diseases and threats. Cleanliness was achieved by other methods, such as rubbing, perfumes, and oils, but not with water. Chapter 3. Morning Hygiene, without toothpaste and soap. The morning of a medieval man began quite differently from ours. Today, we imagine a morning ritual: showering, brushing teeth, taking care of your face and hands. In the Middle Ages, everything was much simpler and much less pleasant. Upon waking up, a person could wash his face with cold water from a jug, or even limit himself to wiping his face and hands with a damp cloth. Water, as we already know, was considered dangerous. So many people tried not to encounter it once again. Washing was more often perceived as a symbolic action, to refresh the face, rather than wash off the dirt. As for the teeth, the picture is even darker here. Toothpaste did not exist in our understanding. But people tried to take care of their teeth in their own way. It is known that the rich used special powders: powdered coal, ash, sometimes crushed herbs or salt. These powders were applied to a cloth or wooden stick and rubbed on the teeth. However, it was of little use. Some powders were too abrasive and erased the enamel. Tooth decay were common. In the chronicles, one can find mentions that people suffered from terrible toothache, but dentistry as such did not exist. Tooth extraction was the only treatment. This was done by barbers who were also hairdressers, surgeons, and dentists. The procedure took place without anesthesia. The tooth was pulled out with forceps or even with bare hands if it was loose. Unsurprisingly, people were afraid of dentists and preferred to endure. Bad breath was a common occurrence. There are descriptions in the chronicles that most of the townspeople had heavy and rotting breath. To kill the smell, chewing mixtures were used: cinnamon, anise, dill seeds, cloves. The nobility could afford precious oriental spices. The poor were content with parsley or mint leaves. As for soap, it existed, but it was rare. In the 9th–10th centuries, soap was made in Marseille and other Mediterranean cities. It was solid, based on olive oil. But it was expensive, so it was mostly used by the rich. Ordinary people washed themselves with lye, a solution of ash and water. The lye was caustic, drying the skin and hair, but there was no other remedy. It was also used for washing clothes. Thus, the morning hygiene of a medieval man was very modest. He wiped his face with a cloth, chewed a blade of grass, and that was it. Chapter 4. The streets of a medieval city are a kingdom of stink. If you were in a medieval city, the first thing that would hit your nose is the smell. We are used to relatively clean streets, sewers, and trash cans. In the Middle Ages, nothing like this existed. The city streets were narrow and dark, and the houses were built very densely. There were almost no sewage systems anywhere. Everything that a person did not need was thrown directly onto the street. Latrines were rarely located inside houses. Usually it was a barrel or a pit, which was then taken out and poured directly into the gutter under the windows. In the cities, there was a profession of night cleaners. They went with barrels and collected sewage, but they did not always do this. Therefore, the streets were covered with a layer of mud, manure, leftovers, and animal corpses were falling. In rainy weather, it all turned into a sticky mess in which the feet got stuck. In the dry, dust rose, mixed with droppings and rot. The smell occupied a special place. The stench was everywhere, and a modern person would hardly be able to stay in such conditions for a long time. But it was common for medieval people. Sometimes the authorities tried to restore order. In Paris, for example, decrees were issued. Do not dare to pour sewage into the street during the day, do it at night. But it didn't do much good. People threw everything out of the windows, and pedestrians walked under the walls so as not to get a surprise on their heads. Pigs, dogs, and chickens roamed the streets freely, tearing up trash and spreading contagion. In some cities, pigs were officially kept for cleaning because they ate leftovers and carrion. Surprisingly, in such conditions, people ate right on the street, sold bread and meat, without caring about sanitation. In the Chronicles, there are descriptions of butchers butchering carcasses right on the dirty pavement and selling meat right there in the sun among the flies. Unsurprisingly, the diseases spread like lightning. Dysentery, cholera, typhus. All this was a part of everyday life. Chapter 5. Clothes, underwear, and eternal dirt. Clean clothes were a luxury in the Middle Ages. Modern people wash their clothes every week and sometimes more often. In the Middle Ages, underwear could be worn for months until it literally began to rot on the body. The poor often did not have a change of clothes at all. What they wore became a part of their body. Dirt, sweat, grease, leftovers. All this was absorbed into the fabric and remained there. The nobility lived a little better, but the situation there was far from ideal. The rich had more sets of clothes, but they were rarely washed. The reason was not only the lack of detergents, but also superstition. It was believed that frequent washing spoils the fabric and destroys the strength of clothing. Underwear, of course, existed. In rich houses, it was sewn from linen. It served as a kind of filter. Dirt and sweat were absorbed into the underwear, and the outerwear remained cleaner. But this linen was rarely changed and washed even less often. The situation was even worse in the villages. People wore coarse woolen clothes directly on their naked bodies. She itched, rubbed her skin, and fleas and lice accumulated in the folds. We tried to keep our clothes fresh with the help of herbs. For example, they put lavender or mint in the chests to kill the smell. Sometimes clothes were rubbed with vinegar or sprinkled with powders. But the effect was minimal. Shoes were also a problem. Peasants often went barefoot because shoes were expensive. Those who had it wore leather shoes for years until they fell apart. The smell from such shoes was terrifying. That is why there are descriptions of smelly peasants in the Chronicles, the smell of which could be felt a few steps away. But you have to understand, everyone smelled bad, both the nobility and the poor. It's just that some people had perfumes to hide the smell, while others didn't. Chapter 6. Eternal neighbors are parasites. Lice, fleas, ticks, and bedbugs are the real companions of medieval man. The fight was waged against them, but it was impossible to win. Lice were everywhere. They lived in their hair, beards, bodies, and clothes. Children often had their hair cut off in order to somehow reduce the number of parasites. But after a few days, the lice appeared again. Fleas lived in the straw that covered the floors of houses. Since the straw was rarely changed, it was infested with insects. Sleeping on such a bed was a torment. A man was bitten by dozens of fleas. Bedbugs hid in wooden beds, cracked floors, and mattresses. They sucked out blood and left itchy bites. People got used to it, but they suffered anyway. Sometimes special means were used to control parasites. For example, they rubbed the body with sulfur, garlic, or tar. Herbal decoctions were rubbed into the hair. But the parasites were too numerous. The barbers, whom we have already mentioned, were engaged not only in haircuts but also in cleaning lice. They combed out the parasites with combs, sometimes burning infected hair. But the truly disastrous thing was that it was the parasites that spread the diseases. It was through flea bites that the plague was transmitted. The lice carried typhus. Therefore, people's everyday companions became tools of mass epidemics. Medieval people took it for granted. There are lines in the Chronicles, "God sent us lice to remind us of humility." That is, parasites were considered a kind of punishment for sins. Chapter 7. Diseases and epidemics are the inevitable companions of dirt. Medieval man lived side by side with diseases. What seems to us to be the tragedy of the century was commonplace for them. And the cause of many troubles was precisely unsanitary conditions. The plague is the main nightmare of the Middle Ages. The Black Death of the 14th century claimed the lives of tens of millions. It was spread by fleas that lived on rats. And the rats were everywhere, in barns, on the streets, in houses. In the conditions of mud and lack of sewage, the rats felt great. People didn't understand exactly how the disease was spreading. It was believed that the reason was the miasma, that is, fetid fumes. And this was partly true. Bad air accompanied dirt and corpses, but the real carrier was sitting in the rodent's fur. To protect themselves, people carried aromatic bags with herbs, wormwood, rosemary. Doctors wore the famous masks of plague doctors with long beaks that were stuffed with spices. It was believed that a pleasant smell protects against infection, but it didn't really help. Besides the plague, there were other diseases. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid are constant companions of cities. They were carried by dirty water and food prepared without hygiene. For example, in 17th century London, despite the best efforts of the authorities, the streets remained overflowing with sewage. The water from the Thames was contaminated, and the epidemics were repeated again and again. Even a common cold could be fatal. The level of medicine was so low that any pneumonia or blood poisoning turned into a sentence. Do not forget about skin diseases. Due to dirt and parasites, the skin suffered constantly. Purulent abscesses, scabies, ulcers. All this was part of everyday life. In the Chronicles, there are descriptions of how knights entered the tournament, despite the fact that their bodies were covered with festering ulcers. Dental diseases were also a real curse. Rotten teeth, fistulas, and gum disease have accompanied people all their lives. The smell of rotting was so strong that it could be felt from a distance. And all this was perceived as the norm. Illness was considered God's punishment. People did not associate it with dirt, but thought that it was payment for sins. Chapter 8. Purity of soul is more important than purity of body. The church played a huge role in shaping ideas about hygiene. On the one hand, the monks knew the value of cleanliness. In monasteries, there were rules to wash your face before prayer, wash your hands before a meal. But on the other hand, the church actively instilled the idea that caring for the body is a manifestation of pride. For the medieval Christian, purity of soul was more important than purity of body. Many saints were famous for their mud. The hagiographies have been preserved, which explicitly stated, "He did not wash for 20 years and wore the same clothes to show humility." Especially revealing is the story of Saint Agnes, who refused to bathe, believing that dirt protects her from sinful thoughts. Or Saint Simon Stylites, who lived on a pillar for decades and was unable to take care of his body. In the eyes of believers, this was a feat. A person refused bodily comforts for the sake of saving the soul. It is not surprising that over time, the idea took root in society. The dirtier the body, the cleaner the soul. Monks who performed austerities were respected for their lack of hygiene. Sometimes it was absurd. In the Chronicles, there are descriptions that some hermits were covered with such a thick layer of dirt that their skin became like a crust. People came to them for blessings, considering them saints. Thus, religion played an important role in making washing seem suspicious, and even harmful. Chapter 9. Court hygiene. Incense instead of water. Nobles and kings had more opportunities to take care of themselves. But that didn't mean they were any purer than commoners. Court life abounded in lavish finery, wigs, and perfume. But behind it all was the same dirt. Water remained banned. So hygiene consisted of hiding odors. Louis XIV, the Sun King, is famous for having washed only a few times in his entire life. He hated water and thought it was bad for his health. Instead of bathing, it was rubbed with aromatic oils and powdered. The court of Versailles was magnificent, but its corridors and rooms were literally drowned in sewage. There were not enough latrines, so the courtiers relieved themselves right in the corners or behind the curtains. There are descriptions of contemporaries who claimed that the smell in Versailles was terrifying. The ladies hid their scents under layers of perfume. Heavy oriental scents were popular. Musk, amber, they were applied generously on clothes, hair, skin. But the perfume did not wash away the dirt, but only masked it. Clothes were changed more often than commoners, but still rarely washed. Puffy dresses could be worn for months. Sometimes they simply sewed new layers of fabric over the old ones to hide the stains. Court ladies and gentlemen often used dry baths. These were special powders made from aromatic powders and herbs that were rubbed on the body. Interestingly, 18th century court wigs are a direct legacy of the medieval habit of hiding dirt. The hair was not washed, but instead shaved, and wigs were put on. These wigs were dusted with powder, often mixed with flour. As a result, clouds of white dust flew around the carriers. The smell was heavy, but that's what fashion looked like. Chapter 10. Cosmetics and beauty hygiene. Instead of caring for the cleanliness of the body, cosmetics came into fashion. Their faces were whitened with leaden whitewash to make their skin look pale. Blush was applied to her cheeks. My eyes were lined with antimony. Such cosmetics not only did not clean the skin, but also destroyed it. The whitewash contained lead, which slowly poisoned the body. But beauty required sacrifice. Rich ladies rubbed their faces and hands with lemon juice or vinegar to make their skin look lighter. Sometimes they used animal blood for blush. The teeth, as we have already said, were in a terrible state. To hide this, women could blacken them with special paints, pretending that this was intended. The hair was dyed with herbs or even animal urine. There were recipes where it was recommended to wet the hair with horse urine to give it a golden hue. Thus, instead of real hygiene, the court people used cosmetics and perfumes. Beauty was built not on cleanliness, but on the disguise of dirt. Chapter 11. Kitchen and food dirt on the table. If we think that the kitchen should have been cleaner than the street, we are very much mistaken. Medieval cooking had almost nothing to do with modern ideas about sanitation. In the city markets, meat was butchered on the ground. The carcasses of the animals were hung on hooks, leaving them in the open sun, among the flies and dust. No one knew about the bacteria, so the spoiled meat was simply flavored with spices to kill the taste and smell. Many dishes were incredibly spicy and spicy for this very reason. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, all imported from the East and were very expensive. The nobility generously seasoned their food, and the peasants often ate simple grain porridge and bread, all washed down with beer. Yes, even the children drank beer. Water was considered dangerous, and beer, even weak ones, went through the brewing process so it was safer. A medieval person could drink several liters of beer a day. Bread was the mainstay of nutrition. It was baked from rye, oats, and sometimes wheat. Bread crusts were used as plates. Meat or sauce was placed on them, and after the meal the crust was thrown away or given to the dogs. Cutlery was a rarity. There were no forks, and they ate with their hands or knives. My hands were not always clean. In the Chronicles, there are complaints. Guests stink of sweat and eat without washing their hands. Animals roamed freely in the yards, and often the kitchen was full of cats, dogs, and pigs. All this added dirt. Food preparation was also primitive. Meat was smoked or salted, fish was dried, and vegetables were stored in cellars. No sterility, no packaging. Not surprisingly, food poisoning was a frequent occurrence. People are used to abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. It was perceived as something ordinary. Chapter 12. The aromas of the Middle Ages. When we say the Middle Ages smelled bad, it sounds too soft. A contemporary of that time would have been shocked by our cleanliness requirements, and we would have been shocked by their familiar smells. The smell was part of everyday life. The body smelled of sweat and dirt. Clothes are made of rotting cloth. At home, there was smoke from bonfires because fireplaces were smoked, and there was no ventilation. The streets smelled of sewage, rotten meat, manure, and burnt. In the village, the smell of animals, silage, and fresh hay was added to this. It was no better inside the houses either. The floor was covered with straw, which accumulated leftovers, crumbs, and debris. The straw was rarely changed, and it began to smell of rot and animal urine. In rich houses, they tried to combat this with incense. In Versailles, for example, vases with flowers and herbs were placed in every room. But it only mixed the smells. Sometimes, at feasts, guests sat in the midst of such a stench that they had to hold an orange stuffed with cloves to their noses. Such aromatic balls have become a fashionable accessory of the nobility. Chapter 13. Travel and roads. Dirt everywhere. Traveling in the Middle Ages was a challenge. The roads were dirty, especially after the rain. The wheels of the wagons sank into the mud, and the riders sank into puddles. There were hotels, but their conditions were far from comfortable. The inns were communal halls where dozens of people slept side by side on straw. Bed bugs and lice were inevitable companions. The food was prepared right there, by the hearth, without any hygiene. Meat, fish, and vegetables were often cooked in one pot. The smell was a constant companion of the road: the sweat of horses, the smell of manure, the smoke of campfires. Even the nobility traveling came across this. In the royal motorcades, they dragged chests of clothes and perfumes with them to somehow overcome the stench. But it was impossible to avoid the dirt. Chapter 14. Childhood in the mud. It is worth mentioning the children separately. In the Middle Ages, babies grew up in conditions that seemed terrifying to us. Diapers were rarely washed. Sometimes they were simply dried and used again. The infant mortality rate was huge. Almost half of the children died before the age of 5. The toys were primitive, most often wooden. The children were playing right on the street, among the mud and manure. Washing children with water was considered dangerous, so they were also restricted in hygiene. Sometimes babies were rubbed with oil or wine to strengthen the body. Despite this, the children survived, and over time their bodies adapted to the dirty conditions. But the price was terrible: constant illnesses and a high mortality rate. Chapter 15. Dark romance of the Middle Ages. Why are we still fascinated by this era? Why do knights and castles seem beautiful to us, even though real life was so grim? The answer is simple. We look at the Middle Ages through the lens of art. Stained glass windows of Gothic cathedrals, chivalric novels, troubadour music. All this really happened. But there was dirt and stench behind the facade. It is this contrast that makes the era so mysterious. It was a time of heroism and horror, beauty and filth. People built magnificent cathedrals, but at the same time they lived in houses infested with parasites. Chapter 16. Conclusion. The terrible truth about hygiene. Today, when we turn on the faucet with water or pick up a toothbrush, it is difficult for us to imagine that once this did not happen. Hygiene is the norm for us, but for a medieval person, it is a rarity and luxury. We learned that baths had existed in Europe for a long time, but they were banned for fear of diseases and sins. That water was considered dangerous, and people preferred dry washing. That the streets of the cities were littered with sewage, and the houses were infested with parasites. We saw that even kings and noble ladies smelled bad, hiding their smells under perfumes and powders. That diseases and epidemics were a part of life, and the purity of the soul was placed above the purity of the body. This terrible truth reminds us how much we should value the achievements of civilization. We live in a world where clean water and soap are available to everyone, where we can take care of our health and body. And maybe next time, while taking a shower or brushing your teeth, you should remember how our ancestors lived in the Middle Ages. and thank fate that we were born right now.